Judith stood in front of her bedroom mirror, turning her head slightly to the left, then to the right. She had curled her hair just the way she used to when Marcus was little, and would watch her get ready for Sunday church, fascinated by the hot iron and the delicate sprays of perfume. She wore a pale blue floral dress, soft and flowing, with a modest neckline and a hint of lace at the cuffs, her favorite, one she hadn't worn in years. Around her neck she fastened her mother's vintage pearls, carefully clasping them with fingers slightly stiffer than they once were. They were heavier than she remembered, not physically but with the weight of memory. She dabbed on a touch of lipstick and, satisfied with her reflection, took one last look around the room, checking her small handbag for tissues, mints, and a photograph of Marcus as a boy, though she wasn't sure why she still carried it. The house was loud when she arrived. Marcus and Hannah's place was newer, sleek and cold, with floors that echoed and walls filled more with decor than warmth. Her grandson, Ethan, greeted her with a hug that was more habitual than heartfelt, already halfway back to his video game as she removed her coat. Hannah kissed her cheek and complimented her dress, though her eyes drifted to her phone even as she spoke. Judith smiled regardless, determined not to read too much into it. She was just happy to be included. Dinner was a long wooden table set for 8. It looked like something out of a magazine, elegant, curated, and strangely impersonal. Judith took her seat at the far end. The dishes were beautiful, the food expensive, and everything felt like a performance. As the conversation unfolded, Ethan made a silly comment about a viral video at school, something juvenile and harmless. Judith, with a warm chuckle, leaned in to tell a story about Marcus at that age. She described how he once wore a pair of his father's too big shoes to school for career day because he thought it made him look more grown up. The memory made her laugh softly as she spoke, and she expected the table to laugh along. But they didn't. Instead, the room fell into a strange hush. Hannah glanced at Marcus, then reached for her wine. Ethan looked down, and the other guests gave awkward smiles before someone changed the subject. Judith sat back slowly, the smile still on her face, but something inside her recoiled. She excused herself to the bathroom, where she stood for a long moment staring into the mirror above the sink. She hadn't realized how quiet the laughter in this family had become. After dessert, as guests trickled toward the door, Marcus found her near the coat rack. He placed a hand on her arm, a gentle touch that somehow carried the weight of a reprimand. "Mom," he said in a voice just above a whisper, "can we talk for a second?" He led her to the hallway, away from the crowd. "I just wanted to mention some of your stories tonight. Sometimes they make people a little uncomfortable." She looked at him, blinking once. "It's not a big deal," he rushed to add, eyes darting. "But we're just trying to create an environment where the kids don't feel awkward, you know? We don't want them to feel embarrassed." Hannah appeared behind him, nodding sympathetically. "We love having you, really. We just want things to feel appropriate. For everyone." Judith didn't argue. She didn't ask what part of that memory was inappropriate. She didn't ask when her presence became a risk to manage. She just nodded slowly, lips pressed into a polite smile, eyes dry and steady. "Of course," she said. "I understand." But inside, something broke. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without anyone noticing. The morning light came through the thin curtains in the kitchen, landing gently on the wooden floor that Judith had scrubbed and polished for over 40 years. The tile was newer now. Of course, Hannah had insisted on it during the last renovation, but Judith could still trace the ghost of the old linoleum beneath it in her mind, like a shadow clinging to memory. She sat at the kitchen table, a chipped porcelain cup warming her hands, and looked around as if seeing the place for the first time, or maybe for the last. This had once been her kingdom. Every room told a story, every object anchored in a moment. She could still see Marcus at 5, barreling down the hallway in socks too big for him, crashing into the wall and laughing like it didn't hurt. The spot beneath the window where he split his chin after trying to jump from the couch still bore a faint discoloration from the blood that wouldn't quite come out. She remembered how he clung to her as she bandaged him, trying not to cry because he thought big boys didn't. Later, he cried anyway, and she held him until he fell asleep, his breath hot against her neck. The corner of the dining room was where they set up the Christmas tree every year. Judith could still picture the crooked angel topper Marcus made in second-grade pipe cleaners and glitter stuck to a paper towel roll. She'd kept it long after the glitter faded, long after he stopped helping decorate. He'd show up just in time for dinner, barely looking up from his phone. The last few years, Hannah had insisted on a professionally decorated tree, something modern and symmetrical. The angel never made it out of the box. She got up slowly and walked toward the hallway. There, at the end of it, was the small nook where Marcus once set up his base camp for birthday sleepovers. Blankets, flashlights, toy soldiers arranged in rows. Judith used to bring snacks and pretend to be scared when the boys jumped out and yelled, "Boo!" That space had been converted into a storage closet now. Hannah's idea again. We need more space for linens. The house had changed, but it hadn't changed. Not really. It still smelled like the lavender soap she used in the laundry. The floorboards in the master bedroom still creaked in the same spot near the dresser. And yet, every time she reached for the light switch or stood too long in the hallway, Judith felt the subtle shift in energy, like a hum just beneath the surface. She was no longer the center here. She was a tolerated presence, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome but hadn't yet been told directly to leave. She wondered when it had started. Was it after the hip surgery, when Hannah began bringing her tea unasked and fluffing her pillows like she was a patient in recovery rather than the woman who had built this household from nothing? Or maybe it was when she'd stopped being invited into the big decisions, vacations planned without her, birthday parties hosted elsewhere. The real sign came when she found her recipe box pushed to the back of the pantry behind boxes of store-bought cake mix. Judith reached out and ran her fingers along the doorframe in the hallway, where faint pencil marks still charted Marcus's growth, inch by inch. She had never erased them. They were uneven, sloppy even, but they were sacred to her. She used to think the house would be hers until the end. Now, with every passing day, it felt like she was trespassing in a life she had built but no longer owned. The sun had barely risen when Judith heard the knock at her door, soft, polite, rehearsed. She was already awake, sitting in bed with a book she hadn't really been reading, the pages open more for habit than interest. The knock was followed by the sound of the door creaking open just slightly, then Hannah's voice, soft and chipper. "Morning, Judith. I brought you some tea." Judith sat up straighter, adjusting the pillow behind her back. "Thank you, dear," she said, accepting the cup with both hands. It was chamomile, her usual, but weaker than she liked. Still, she smiled politely and sipped. Hannah stood there with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, hands folded neatly in front of her. Her hair was already styled, makeup flawless despite the early hour. Judith, in her worn robe and uncombed hair, suddenly felt like a guest in a hotel where she hadn't paid her tab. "I thought we might talk for just a minute," Hannah said, taking a seat at the edge of the bed as if it were her place to do so. "Nothing serious, just something to think about." Judith didn't answer, just took another sip of the tea, her back stiffening slightly. She already knew where this was going. The phrasing was always the same. Just something to think about. Harmless words, floating like feathers, but weighted with intent. "It's just," Hannah began, glancing at the mug in Judith's hand as though searching for the right tone. "You've been saying your knees hurt more lately. And the stairs, well, they aren't getting any easier, are they?" Judith nodded faintly, non-committal. She stared into the tea as if it might offer a response for her. "And we've been looking into some options," Hannah continued, her voice light, almost cheerful. "Just some nice places, assisted living. Not a home, you know? Some of them are really beautiful, great facilities, lots of activities. You'd have your own space, of course, independence." Judith said nothing, her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "I mean," Hannah added quickly, "this house is lovely, really, but it's a lot to manage. The upkeep, the bills, the stairs. It's a big place for one person. We just thought maybe it's time to consider whether it's too much for you now." There it was. Hannah didn't look at her when she said it. She stared at the floral pattern on the bedspread instead, as if that would soften the blow. Judith nodded slowly, a tight smile forming on her lips. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said quietly. I appreciate your concern. Oh, of course, Hannah rushed to say, a little too quickly. It's only a suggestion, no pressure, just something to keep in mind. Judith smiled again and lifted the cup to her lips, letting the lukewarm tea sit on her tongue before swallowing. Her spine, despite the pain that came with mornings these days, remained perfectly straight. She had heard this before. Variations of it, whispered at family gatherings or delivered in cheerful tones after doctor appointments. They all wore the same disguise: concern. But beneath it was the quiet erosion of space, of dignity, of the right to simply be. When Hannah finally stood to leave, Judith watched her go without a word. The door clicked shut, and she was alone again. She set the tea down on the nightstand and looked around her room in her house. For now, the house was quiet, the kind of silence that presses in around you and makes even the smallest sounds feel amplified. A faucet dripping in the kitchen, the whir of the ceiling fan overhead, the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Judith lay still in bed, her hands folded on her stomach, eyes open in the dark. Sleep wouldn't come. It hadn't come easily in years, but tonight it felt especially far away, hovering just out of reach like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. She turned her head toward the wall, the one that separated her room from Marcus and Hannah's. At first, she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The usual muffled sounds of them getting ready for bed, the creak of the closet door, the soft thud of shoes being kicked off. Then voices, quiet but not quiet enough. I just don't think she can manage much longer. Hannah's voice filtered through, muted but clear enough in intention. Judith's breath caught. She didn't move, barely even blinked. The pillow felt suddenly colder beneath her cheek. She strained to listen, each word falling like a drop of water into stillness. Marcus responded, his tone lower, harder to decipher. A pause. Then, we need to start talking about selling. The deed's still in her name, but... The rest was muffled by the rustling of sheets, maybe a drawer opening. Judith sat up slowly, her body stiff, her joints aching from the sudden shift. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat there in her nightgown, the hem brushing her shins, her bare feet just above the cool floor. She's too far gone to handle all this, Hannah said, quieter now, as if realizing she might be overheard. You saw her at dinner, rambling. That story about your shoes? Everyone looked so uncomfortable. She's just getting old, that's all, Marcus murmured. Exactly, Hannah replied, as if that were the point. Old enough that it's time. There was more talk about finances, the market, assisted living options, but Judith stopped listening. The blood was rushing in her ears now, a low roaring tide that made everything else sound distant and unreal. She sat in the dark, her hands clenched in her lap, her back rigid. The words circled her like vultures. Sell, deed, too far gone. How quickly it all turned. How quietly. No big moment, no confrontation. Just whispers in the night, like a quiet betrayal delivered with clean sheets and a cup of tea. They didn't know she was awake. They didn't know she was hearing every word. Maybe they thought she wouldn't understand even if she did. Judith turned her head slowly toward the window. The moonlight spilled through the slats of the blinds, striping the floor in pale silver. The room looked the same as always, but it no longer felt like hers. It was like a stage set, and she had become the aging prop everyone politely avoided. She didn't cry. The tears didn't come. Something heavier settled in their place, cold, bitter weight in her chest that told her she was no longer safe in her own home. She sat there for a long time, listening, remembering, planning. The sun was barely up when Judith padded into the small laundry room where she kept the fireproof lockbox beneath a pile of neatly folded quilts. Her knees ached as she bent down, lifting the heavy lid with effort. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that something inside her had shifted in the dark last night, something sharp and deliberate. The voices from the next room still echoed in her head, and sleep had never come. Instead, she had sat at the kitchen table for hours in silence, her tea gone cold, staring at the worn patterns in the wood like they might spell out an answer. She pulled out a manila envelope near the bottom of the box, careful not to scatter the other papers. Inside was the original property deed, her name alone, Typed neatly in block letters across the topand, another document with a blue sticky note in Marcus's handwriting. Just a formality. Sign and we'll take care of everything. Judith remembered the day clearly now. She had just returned home from hip surgery, still foggy from painkillers, when Marcus came by with a folder of papers and a pen. It's just to make sure we can handle things if something happens, Mom. Bills, errands, basic stuff, he said. He had sounded so gentle, so reasonable. And she, exhausted and grateful not to be alone, signed without reading. She stared at the signature now, small and looping, her hand still weak from surgery at the time. Her stomach turned. She had trusted him. Of course she had. What mother doesn't want to believe her child has her best interest at heart? She placed the documents into her handbag, then stood at the kitchen counter, flipping open the old address book she hadn't touched in years. Most of the entries were out of date, people long since moved or gone. But she found it Evelyn Arlen, attorney at law. The same woman who had helped her finalize George's will all those years ago. A practical, composed woman with a tidy office and a firm handshake. Judith remembered liking her. She dialed the number with steady fingers. When the receptionist answered, Judith simply said, "I'd like to schedule an appointment, as soon as possible. It's about a property issue." The woman took her name, offered a time for the next day, and Judith accepted without hesitation. She hung up the phone and leaned on the counter for a moment, her heart pounding not from fear, but from something fiercer. Resolve. Beneath the ache in her joints, beneath the trembling that came after long nights and longer years, there was still steel in her. They had forgotten that. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. She made herself breakfast, but didn't touch it. She wandered the house, touching the backs of chairs, the frame of the living room doorway, the cabinet where she once stored Ethan's cookies. This house wasn't just walls, it was her history. And someone had decided she was too far gone to deserve it. She gathered her things, slipped on her shoes, and sat by the window, waiting, not passively, not anymore. She had an appointment, and she intended to learn exactly what she was still entitled to. The office smelled faintly of lavender and paper-two scents Judith associated with safety. The receptionist had offered her tea when she arrived, but she declined. Her hands were already full with the worn leather handbag that held the manila envelope she had carried like a fragile secret. She sat on the edge of the chair in the waiting room, the old clock ticking steadily above her, each second stretching longer than the last. When Evelyn Arlen stepped out to greet her, she looked almost exactly as Judith remembered, silver hair neatly twisted at the back of her head, reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a soft scarf knotted at the neck. She had always carried herself with calm certainty, the kind that made clients feel like nothing could spin out of control under her watch. "Judith," Evelyn said warmly, reaching out both hands. "It's been years." Judith stood, smiling faintly as she accepted the embrace. "Too many." Evelyn led her down a narrow hallway into a small sunlit office where a tidy desk waited with a legal pad and a small vase of violets. Judith sat in the chair across from her and placed the envelope on the desk without a word. Evelyn opened it gently, as if it might contain something living. She spread out the documents with practiced care: the deed, the power of attorney, and a few utility forms Marcus had tucked in without explanation. Evelyn scanned them quietly, occasionally adjusting her glasses. The silence in the room grew heavier by the minute. Judith sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching Evelyn's face for any sign of what she might say. She wasn't sure what she hoped to hear. Maybe that there was still time to take control. Maybe that she hadn't been foolish to trust her son. Finally, Evelyn looked up. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was gentle. "The power of attorney," she said, tapping the document with her pen, "was never notarized, and there's no witness signature either." Judith blinked. So, Evelyn said. "It's not valid. It holds no legal authority. He may have meant well, but unless you re-signed something more recently, Marcus has no power over your financial decisions." "Not now, not then." Judith exhaled slowly, the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, finally escaping her chest. It felt like a knot in her ribs had come undone. "And the deed?" she asked softly. Evelyn slid the property paper toward her. Still in your name alone. Hasn't been transferred. Hasn't even been motioned for transfer. A long silence passed between them. Judith's eyes stayed on the paper, but her mind was racing. All the conversations, all the careful suggestions, all the veiled talk about doing what's best. And yet here it was proof that she still held the reins, however lightly. Evelyn leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. Judith, she said quietly, I'm glad you came. I truly am. But I need to ask, are you ready for what this means? Judith looked up, her face calm but steady. What does it mean? It means you can act, however you see fit. Sell the house, change your will, revoke access, make a clean break if that's what you want. But once you take that step, you'll be crossing a line. You'll be choosing yourself, not the version of you they're comfortable with. Judith thought of the whispers through the wall, the chamomile tea, the patronizing smiles. She thought of how small her world had become, how carefully she'd been managed. She looked Evelyn in the eye and nodded once. Then it's time I stopped being comfortable for them. The sound of the vacuum cleaner hummed through the house like a memory of order. Judith moved slowly but steadily, pushing the machine over the living room rug with quiet determination. The rug was one Hannah had insisted on modern, gray, geometric, but Judith still treated it with care. She dusted each surface by hand, polished the brass handles on the cabinet Marcus never opened, and wiped down the windows until the light coming through them had no smudges to distort it. It had been years since she cleaned this thoroughly, years since she'd taken this much time with her own home. She could feel it in her shoulders, in her lower back, in her fingers that were beginning to ache, but the ache was satisfying, grounding. This wasn't the kind of cleaning you did because someone was coming over. This was the kind you did when you were taking something back. Marcus and Hannah had left early that morning for a weekend getaway to some wine resort 3 towns over. They hadn't invited her. They never did. But they had mentioned, offhandedly, that they'd be gone until Sunday night. Try to get some rest while we're gone, Marcus had said with the same tone he might use for a child or a pet. She nodded then, but inside, something was already turning. Now the floors gleamed. The scent of lemon polish lingered in the air. She had even taken the liberty of rearranging the family photos on the mantel so that the one of her and George on their wedding day stood front and center. She had moved the more recent ones, Marcus and Hannah, in matching shirts at the beach, Ethan's graduation photo to the side. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror-neat blouse, slacks, hair pulled back into a clean, low bun, then opened the door. A young man in khakis and a button-up shirt stood on the porch, clipboard in one hand and tablet in the other. His name tag read Troy. He looked to be no older than 28, with a polite, distracted expression that told her he'd already decided she was someone peripheral. "Hi there," he said, glancing past her shoulder. "I'm here for the inspection. I was told I'd be meeting with the homeowner." Judith smiled, stepping back to let him in. "You just did," she said. "I'm the owner." Troy blinked, caught between surprise and mild embarrassment. "Oh, sorry, I just assumed." "Don't worry," she said lightly, closing the door behind him. "Most people do." He recovered quickly, clearing his throat and flipping through his paperwork. "Right. Okay, great. So, I'll start in the basement if that's all right." "Of course. Let me know if you need anything. The furnace is new, but the water heater's original." He gave her an appreciative nod, then disappeared down the stairs. Judith stood in the hallway for a moment, alone again, her hand resting on the stair rail. She could hear the low creak of Troy's footsteps as he moved below, making notes, examining systems. It was really happening. The machine had started to turn. She wasn't just preparing the house for someone else, she was preparing her life for what came next. The dining room was dressed up more than usual. Judith noticed the new table runner pale ivory linen with delicate embroidery at the ends and a row of mason jars filled with pastel wildflowers, arranged just so. Hannah beamed with a pride that bordered on performative, hovering over the dishes like a maitre d', brushing away invisible specks and adjusting cutlery that hadn't shifted. "Pinterest-inspired," she said, with a pointed glance at Judith, as if awaiting applause. Judith smiled and leaned in to examine the display. "It's lovely, dear, really, so clever." Her voice was gentle, her tone practiced. She'd been perfecting this kind of tone for weeks. The plates were filled with grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, neatly portioned, calorie-conscious, overly curated. Judith remembered a time when dinner was messy roasts carved right at the table, gravy spilling, second helpings passed before the first bites were even swallowed. Now the room smelled like citrus and balsamic vinegar. There was no butter on the table. Marcus, seated at the head like he was rehearsing for some imagined future, turned to Judith halfway through the meal. "So, Mom, how's everything going? You've been quiet lately." She dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, smiled softly. "Oh, I've just been resting, letting the two of you run the world. You're both so busy." Hannah chuckled lightly, but didn't lift her eyes from her plate. Judith set her fork down. "And your job, Marcus? Still at that insurance firm, right?" He perked up. "Actually, we just closed a huge client account last week. Might even be a promotion in it." Judith gasped, wide-eyed and appropriately impressed. "Oh, how wonderful! Your father would be proud. He always said you had a head for numbers." She could feel Hannah's glance dart toward her, just for a second. Judith pretended not to notice. "Ethan's doing well at school, I hope," she added, her voice light. "Straight A's," Hannah said, lifting her wine glass. "But he's really into robotics now. There's a team thing after school, so he's always staying late." "Smart boy," Judith said warmly. "I'd be happy to watch him one evening if you two need a break. I know how hard it is to make time as a couple." Marcus smiled. "That's thoughtful, Mom." Judith only nodded and resumed eating, slowly, gracefully. Every movement of her hands was controlled, every expression rehearsed. The warmth she showed was the same kind you'd find in a department store candle, pleasant enough, but artificial. Inside, she was ice. By then, the lease had already been signed. 2 days earlier, she'd met the landlord of a small cottage on the east side of town. It had a garden blooming with ivy, a front porch swing, and high windows that caught the afternoon sun in a way that reminded her of something long lost. She'd signed her name neatly at the bottom of the lease agreement, declining the tenant insurance with a polite smile. "I won't be bringing much," she'd said. Now, watching Marcus joke about corporate bonuses and Hannah comment on rustic place settings, Judith merely smiled and passed the bread basket. The play was nearly over. Only a few more scenes to get through. The room was quiet except for the scratching of pens and the soft shuffle of paper. Evelyn slid the final page across the desk with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Judith took the pen in her hand and paused, just for a second, letting her eyes drift over the line where her name would go. Then, without a word, she signed. Her handwriting was slower now than it had been in her youth, but it was still unmistakably her sharp, measured with just the slightest tilt. "That's it," Evelyn said, offering a small smile. "The house is officially sold. They came in over asking, cash buyer. They want to move quickly, but they're flexible with your exit date." Judith nodded, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. "That won't be a problem." Evelyn gave her a searching look. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Judith said, adjusting the strap of her handbag and rising from the chair. "I'm just tired of pretending it's still mine. Now I don't have to." She left the office with a new weight in her purse, legal confirmation that the house no longer belonged to her and that she no longer belonged to the people who lived in it. The sun outside was warm against her face as she walked down the sidewalk. She didn't feel sad. If anything, she felt lighter, like someone who'd finally remembered where the exits were. That evening, the house was calm. The television murmured in the background as Judith sat in the armchair, knitting a scarf she'd already decided she wouldn't finish. She was halfway through a row when Marcus came in, hands tucked behind his back, wearing that tight, professional smile he always put on when he had something unpleasant to say, but wanted to dress it as concern. "Hey, Mom," he said, walking in like he still believed this was his domain. "Got something for you." She looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh?" He handed her a glossy trifold brochure, freshly printed and creased. A gold emblem adorned the cover, along with a picture of a laughing couple in their 70s, strolling along a garden path. Silver Pines Retirement Community, the title read, where independence meets peace of mind. They've got excellent reviews, Marcus said, perching on the arm of the couch. Modern units, activities every day, on-site medical care. It could be a really good fit. Judith flipped the brochure open, studying the photos. Clean rooms, happy seniors. The illusion of dignity wrapped in soft lighting and gentle slogans. You've really done your homework, she said quietly. We even scheduled a tour, Marcus added, his voice bright. Sunday afternoon, just to look. No pressure. She looked up at him and smiled faintly, her eyes unreadable. That's very thoughtful. He seemed relieved, like a burden had been lifted. He patted her shoulder awkwardly before rising. We just want what's best for you, Mom. She watched him leave the room, listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, and then looked back at the brochure in her lap. The house had sold. Her name was no longer on the deed. And Silver Pines, with all its soft promises, could wait. She had her own plans, now plans, no one had scheduled for her. The aroma of garlic and rosemary filled the house long before the guests arrived. Judith moved through the kitchen with steady purpose, basting the roast lamb in its shallow dish, her oven-mitted hand lingering at the edge of the pan. She had started preparing the meal the day before, marinating the meat, kneading the dough for her lemon pie crust, slicing the vegetables so thin they curled at the edges like ribbons. Her hands ached, and her knees protested every movement, but she welcomed the pain. It kept her grounded, focused. By late afternoon, the table was set with her good china set George had insisted on buying when they first got married, saying every home needed at least one thing that felt like Sunday. Crystal glasses, polished silver, cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. It looked like a holiday, and in some way, it was. A farewell that only one person at the table would recognize. When the doorbell rang, Judith opened it with a practiced smile. Marcus was first through the door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same shirt he always chose for nice occasions. Hannah followed with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, kissed Judith's cheek, and commented on how wonderful everything smelled. Ethan trailed behind them, already pulling out his phone as he entered. Judith thanked them, ushering them inside. Dinner's just about ready, she said. Sit, relax. I've made enough to feed the neighborhood. And she had. The table groaned beneath the weight of the roast lamb, golden and steaming in its dish, a platter of roasted root vegetables glistening with olive oil, a salad tossed with slivers of pear and crumbled cheese, a basket of warm rolls, and, at the center, the lemon pie, delicate meringue peaks, catching the light like spun sugar. They ate eagerly. Marcus carved thick slices of lamb for everyone, then helped himself to a second. Ethan picked at his food at first, but even he went back for more. Hannah moaned appreciatively at the pie, dabbing the corner of her mouth with her napkin as if trying to restrain herself from devouring the rest. Laughter bubbled around the table, stories, complaints, updates. Judith watched them quietly, refilling glasses, asking questions about school, about work. She asked Marcus about the client account he had mentioned last week, feigning interest with a soft smile and well-timed nods. When Hannah complimented the centerpieces, the very same ones Judith had pulled from her own garden earlier that morning, Judith murmured a humble thank you. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and dessert, Marcus leaned back in his chair, sighing. Bills are brutal right now, he said, half to himself. Between the mortgage and Ethan's extracurriculars, I feel like I'm bleeding money. Hannah set down her fork. Once the house sells, things will be easier, she said, as though Judith weren't sitting at the same table. Judith met her eyes across the candlelight, her expression calm, unreadable. Then she turned to Marcus and said, almost absently, yes, much easier. And she meant it. The house was quiet in the way, only Sleeping Home's Eridim, still, filled with the distant creaks of old wood settling under its own history. Judith stood at the foot of the stairs, her overnight bag in one hand and her purse in the other. The kitchen light glowed behind her, the only illumination in the house. Above her, she could hear faint snoring, a door shifting on its hinges with a soft groan as someone turned in their sleep. She paused, just for a moment, letting the silence seep into her bones. This house had once pulsed with life, with sticky fingers and muddy shoes and music played too loudly on Saturday mornings. Now it was a husk, occupied by people who measured her presence in decibels and decaying patience. Judith stepped into the kitchen one last time. On the counter beside the sink, she placed the house key. She didn't hesitate, didn't fumble. It made a soft, final sound as it hit the tile, like the last period at the end of a letter you'll never send. Then she reached into her purse, pulled out the small yellow sticky note she'd written an hour earlier, and pressed it neatly onto the refrigerator door. Good luck with the bills. There was no bitterness in the handwriting, no scrawl of anger. Just her usual looping cursive, steady and clean. No salutation, no signature. She knew Marcus would recognize it instantly. She hoped he'd read it twice. The storage unit was already half full. She had made trips quietly over the past week, boxes of books, keepsakes, her mother's porcelain tea set wrapped in bath towels to keep them from rattling in the trunk. Tonight, there were only a few things left. Her clothing, some framed photographs, a few favorite books. She loaded them with care, the night air brisk against her cheeks, and tied her cardigan tighter across her shoulders. The drive took less than 20 minutes, her old sedan humming gently along the empty roads. She hit every green light. The cottage sat nestled on a quiet corner in a modest neighborhood across town. It wasn't grand, but it was clean and full of light. A porch swing dangled slightly in the wind, and flower beds lined the walkway, mostly empty this time of year, but Judith was already imagining what she'd plant in spring. Her key turned in the lock with a satisfying click. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar. Her landlord had been kind enough to stock the fridge with a few basics: milk, bread, eggs. She kicked off her shoes, set her bags down gently by the couch, and moved through the space with a strange reverence. Her name was on the lease. No one else's. She made a cup of tea and stood by the front window, watching the street lamps flicker against the pavement. Somewhere across town, her family slept, unaware that the house they woke up in was no longer theirs. Judith took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes calm. She didn't feel guilt. She didn't feel vengeance. She felt free. The morning sun slipped through the blinds in soft slats, warming the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway. Marcus stirred in bed, reaching out instinctively to the other side, but Hannah was already up. He groaned, rolled over, and glanced at his phone. 12 a.m. The house was unusually quiet. No clinking dishes. No smell of coffee or Judith humming off-key in the kitchen like she sometimes did. Odd. He pulled on a shirt and padded barefoot down the stairs, yawning. "Mom?" he called, not loudly. He didn't want to wake Ethan. No answer, just the distant hum of the fridge. He checked the living room, empty. No knitting basket by the couch, no throw blanket, no sign of life. The guest room door was open, the bed stripped bare. At first, he thought she might be out for a walk, but something about the stillness of the place made his stomach knot. That's when he saw it. A letter taped to the inside of the front door. Not handwritten, formal, typed, clipped neatly into a plastic sleeve. Legal-looking. He pulled it free and scanned the first few lines. His mouth fell open. Notice of sale. Title transfer complete. Effective immediately. The color drained from his face. "Han!" he shouted, louder this time, voice cracking. "Hannah!" She came running down the stairs in pajama pants and a robe, mascara still smudged from the night before. "What? What is it?" Marcus shoved the notice into her hands. "She sold it. The house. It's gone." Hannah blinked at the paper, her fingers trembling as they traced the black ink. "What? What does this mean?" "It means we're not the owners," he snapped. "It means we're standing in someone else's house." The refrigerator door was ajar. A sticky note clung to the front, written in Judith's perfect script. "Good luck with the bills." Hannah tore it off and flung it across the kitchen. "You said you had power of attorney. You said we could make decisions." Marcus ran both hands through his hair, pacing. "I thought I did. We signed the papers after her surgery." "She never filed them, Marcus. You didn't file them properly." He reached for his phone with shaking fingers and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. Again. Again. No answer. You need to fix this, Hannah hissed. The credit cards are maxed. We borrowed against the house. I know, Marcus muttered. We used her home equity line for the kitchen remodel. I know. Hannah stared at him, eyes wide. That's a mortgage now, Marcus. It's in your name, not hers. He sank onto the couch, his heart hammering, the enormity of it all descending like a tidal wave. The bank would come calling. The payments wouldn't stop. And Judith quiet, smiling, little old lady Judith had vanished like smoke. Somewhere across town, she was sipping tea in a sunlit cottage, reading the paper, not answering her phone, letting them feel for once what she'd felt for years. Unseen, powerless, left with the mess. The knock on the door was sharp and impatient. Judith set down her mug of tea on the windowsill and rose slowly, smoothing the front of her cardigan as she walked to the door. She already knew who it was. Somehow, she'd known the moment she opened her eyes that morning. She undid the latch and opened the door to find Eli standing there, shoulders squared, fists clenched, and a storm in his eyes. You didn't even say goodbye, he said before she could speak. Judith looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped aside. Come in. He hesitated only a second before walking past her into the cottage. His eyes darted around the small living room books neatly arranged on low shelves, a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table, sunlight warming the hardwood floor. It was humble, but it was hers. He turned to face her again. Everyone's a mess. Dad's losing it. Mom's threatening to sue you. You just disappeared. Judith nodded slowly and walked over to a chair by the window, easing herself down with a soft sigh. I know. Eli didn't sit. He stood with his arms crossed, his chest rising and falling as he tried to contain the sharp edges of his hurt. Why would you do this? You blindsided all of us. Me. Judith folded her hands in her lap. Because you were the only one I didn't want to burden. His brow furrowed. What does that mean? She looked out the window for a moment before speaking. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. You've grown up believing a version of this family that isn't true. You think your grandfather was a good man. That your father was raised with love. That I was just the doting, delicate matriarch, quietly watching from the background. But the truth is darker than that, Eli. He shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't interrupt. George wasn't kind, she said. Not to me, not to Marcus. He was cruel when no one was looking. He had a way of making you feel like every mistake you made was proof you didn't deserve to exist. He never laid a finger on your father, not in the way most people think of abuse. But words can hit just as hard. He made Marcus feel small, and when I tried to protect him, I paid for it behind closed doors. Eli's expression began to shift shock, creeping in at the edges of his indignation. Your father was only a boy, Eli, she continued, and boys do what they must to survive. Marcus rewrote the story in his head so it didn't hurt so much. He turned George into a hero because that was easier than accepting he'd been broken by someone he loved. But in doing that, he inherited the worst parts of him. Eli sat down now, quietly, on the edge of the couch. Judith's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. I didn't leave to hurt him. I left because the hurt had gone on long enough. And I didn't say goodbye to you because you're different. I see it. You don't carry what they carry. And I didn't want to stain that. Eli stared at the floor, quiet for a long time. Then he looked up. Why tell me now? Because you came looking for the truth, she said. And I think you're old enough to decide what to do with it. He didn't reply. But he stayed. It started at the post office. Mrs. Lawton, who had lived on Elm Street for 40 years and never missed a Tuesday at the senior center, mentioned to the clerk that Judith Wilkins had moved. Left in the middle of the night, she whispered, with nothing but a pie tin in the sink and a note on the fridge. She said it with a curious mix of admiration and disbelief, as if Judith had pulled off a magic trick no one saw coming. From there, the story grew. By Thursday, the rumors had made their way to choir practice, the hair salon, and the checkout line at Dawson's Market. They morphed like folklore, gaining layers and details no one could verify. Some said Judith had sold the house for cash and walked away with $500,000 in a duffel bag. Others insisted it wasn't about money at all, that it was about betrayal, about reclaiming something no one had even known was taken from her. And then came the question everyone seemed to ask, but no one dared voice too loudly. What happened in that house? At first, the talk focused on the sale. She was sharper than they gave her credit for, someone said at the diner counter. Always figured Marcus was a bit too smooth. That wife of his, always smiling with her mouth, never her eyes. But it didn't take long for the rumors to find a new current Eli. Someone overheard him at the library, asking about memoirs on generational trauma. Someone else saw him sitting with Judith on her porch, head in his hands. Then a woman who taught at his school years ago mentioned he'd looked haunted the last time he came by. Something happened, she said in a low voice. He's seeing his family differently now. When a teenager in town changes how they speak about their parents, people take notice. When that teenager's grandmother vanishes, sells the family home, and surfaces on the other side of town sipping tea and tending roses, the questions get louder. Whispers followed Marcus to the hardware store. He smiled a little too wide, laughed a little too loud. "Mom's getting older," he explained to anyone who brought her up. "We just wanted what's best for her." She didn't want to hear it. But that explanation, once comforting, no longer landed the way it used to. What used to sound like responsibility now carried the faint scent of control. A few people recalled moments they'd witnessed over the years, a snapped response at a church bake sale, the way Hannah once took a pie out of Judith's hands and placed it on a different table without a word. Small things. Things no one had questioned at the time. But now, in the glow of gossip and hindsight, they all began to look different. Judith, meanwhile, said nothing. She didn't deny. She didn't explain. She took her walks through the neighborhood, nodded politely when people passed, and accepted invitations to potlucks and poetry readings without offering her own story. Let them talk, she thought, watering the daisies by her front porch. Let them stitch together the pieces however they pleased. The truth had been buried for so long, it deserved a little airven if it came through rumor. The box was tucked beneath a folded quilt in the back of her closet, its corners frayed from years of shifting with the seasons. Judith carried it to the table with careful hands, as if something inside might break, though everything in it already had. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing its contents. A bundle of letters, some sealed, others half-written and folded, the ink faded but legible. There were postcards never sent, birthday cards that had never made it to the mailbox, and apologies she'd never had the courage or perhaps the permission to voice. She had gone through most of them the night before, reading them under the low glow of her bedside lamp, her eyes moving slowly across old regrets and near confessions. But one letter remained, still sealed in its original envelope, yellowed at the edges. In careful handwriting across the front it read, "Marcus, age 9. Judith stared at it a long while before opening it. The paper inside crackled faintly as she unfolded it. She recognized the way her handwriting used to look, tighter, more rigid, like she'd been trying too hard to keep control. She sat down, the letter shaking only slightly in her hand, and began to read it aloud to herself. "Dear Marcus," she whispered, voice soft in the silence. "You're asleep right now, upstairs in your rocket ship bed. You don't know that downstairs, I am writing you a letter I may never give you. I'm too much of a coward, I suppose. Or maybe I'm just too afraid of the truth." She swallowed. "I want to say I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry that I didn't leave him when I should have. I told myself that staying was safer than going, that if I stayed, I could shield you. That if I just managed him right, if I avoided the landmines, you'd never feel the sharp edges. I was wrong, Marcus. I was so terribly wrong." Her hand brushed lightly over the paper, fingers trembling. "You never said anything, not out loud, but I saw it. I saw the way you flinched when his voice got loud. I saw how you disappeared into yourself whenever he entered the room. And I told myself it was temporary, that boys forget things, that love would be enough to patch the cracks." Judith paused and took a breath. "I was scared too, Marcus, scared of what he'd do if I left. Scared of how we'd survive. But mostly, I was scared that if I told you the truth about him, you'd grow up hating the part of yourself that came from him. I never wanted that. I just wanted to protect you, even from the memory." The words sat in the air like dust. She folded the letter slowly and stood up. In the small fireplace at the far side of the room, the embers from the earlier burn still glowed faintly. Judith walked over, knelt, and placed the letter on top of the ash. For a moment it sat there, whole. Then it curled, blackened, and vanished into smoke. She watched it go without a word, her eyes dry, her shoulders still. It was the last one. There was nothing more she needed to keep, and nothing left she was afraid to let go. The casserole dish steamed as it was set in the center of the table, its golden crust bubbling at the edges. Around it, plates were already filled with salad and fresh rolls, and laughter rose like warm bread in the modest dining room. Judith sat at the end of the table, her chair pulled in close, a cloth napkin on her lap. Across from her, little Lily was explaining, in great detail, how her school's pet turtle had once escaped and been found in the art supply closet 2 days later. Judith smiled and nodded along, offering the occasional "oh my" and "how clever" in all the right places. It was easy. This wasn't her family, no blood ties, no shared holidays, but it felt more like family than anything she'd known in a long while. The neighbors had started inviting her to these Sunday dinners a month ago, insisting she come just once, but she'd come again and again. Because here, no one asked if she needed help remembering things. No one corrected her stories or passed her off like a burden. They just listened. They just cared. The front door creaked open unexpectedly, and a familiar voice called out, "Hello?" Judith turned just as Eli stepped into view, a young woman behind him with a bright smile and a bottle of lemonade tucked under one arm. "Eli," Judith stood up, surprised but pleased. "I wasn't expecting you." He came around the table and hugged her gently. "I know. Thought I'd drop by. Audrey wanted to meet you." Audrey grinned and offered her hand. "We've heard so much about you." The neighbors made space at the table without hesitation, scooting chairs and sliding dishes to the side. Audrey fit in instantly, chatting easily, complimenting the meal, asking questions. Eli reached into his jacket and pulled something from an envelope. "I found this in one of Dad's old boxes in the garage," he said, handing it to Judith. "Figured you should have it." It was a photograph, yellowed and curling slightly at the corners. Judith stared at it, her breath catching. She and her sister Margaret stood side by side in front of an old oak tree, their arms around each other, laughing at something just out of frame. She couldn't remember what, but she remembered how it felt, the closeness, the lightness that came with being seen by someone who understood you completely. "She was beautiful," Audrey said softly. Judith nodded, her voice tight. "She was. We were only 14 months apart. People used to think we were twins." "What was she like?" Eli asked. Dad never talked much about her. Judith looked at him, really looked. And then, slowly, she began to speak. About summers at the lake, about late-night talks under shared blankets, about how Margaret used to draw birds in the margins of her schoolbooks, about how she had been brave in ways Judith had never learned to be until much later. No one interrupted her. No one redirected the conversation. They just listened. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Judith wasn't answering questions about bank accounts, prescriptions, or living arrangements. She wasn't being measured by her usefulness or corrected into silence. She was simply being remembered by others, and maybe now, by herself. The package arrived on a rainy Thursday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of twine that reminded Judith of something from a time when the world moved slower. The return label read Evelyn Lang, stamped neatly in the corner. Judith didn't open it right away. She set it on the table beside her teacup, finished washing her breakfast dishes, and took her time drying each one before finally sitting down. She unwrapped the twine, peeled back the paper, and opened the small box within. Inside lay 2 items, a thick envelope marked Will, Testament, Final Update, and beneath it, a thinner envelope with delicate script on the front that read, "For Eli's eyes only." Judith opened the larger envelope first. She already knew what it would say. Evelyn had confirmed it over the phone weeks ago. Still, seeing it in writing gave the decision weight. The house she no longer lived in, the modest savings, the furniture, the family albums, all of it would go to Eli. There would be no contest. Marcus wouldn't dare. Not now. But it was the second envelope that held her focus. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment, then she gently pried it open. Inside was a photograph, folded to preserve its corners. She unfolded it carefully. George's face stared back at her, not as the clean-cut family man people still imagined, but raw and bruised. His right eye darkened, the skin swollen and angry. She remembered the moment clearly, even decades later. It had been the night he grabbed Marcus by the arm too hard, slammed the door and roared something that Judith never forgot. She'd walked into the kitchen, picked up the cast-iron skillet, and swung without hesitation. He never laid a hand on the boy again. Tucked behind the photograph was a single diary page, copied in Evelyn's handwriting. Judith had dictated it to her weeks ago, too shaky to write it herself. If no one ever tells you who he really was, then he wins. I won't let that happen, not even in death. She exhaled slowly. Reading it felt heavier now than when she'd said it aloud. Below it, a final note was written, this one in Judith's own hand, uneven but certain. Tell the truth when you're ready, but know this, you broke the cycle. That's worth more than any inheritance. She ran her fingertips over the words. It had taken her years to understand that survival and silence were not the same thing. For most of her life, she had chosen quiet as a form of safety for Marcus, for herself. But Eli had asked questions. He had listened without turning away. He had seen the cracks and chosen not to look for glue, but to ask why the glass was breaking in the first place. Judith resealed the envelope and addressed it again. To be opened when you're ready. She placed it in a drawer near her bed, beside the photo of her and Margaret, and closed it gently. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, Judith felt lighter. Not finished, but at peace. Some truths take a lifetime to tell. Others wait for someone brave enough to ask.